In the last video, we looked at how all sin is a falling short of the glory of God. So we've moved from this idea of the glory of God into this idea of our own sin and rebellion as falling short of God's glory. And sin is fundamentally transgressing God's command, disobeying, and it's a failure to honor him and worship him and obey him as God. And so we looked at this theme of glory, falling short of the glory of God, a failure to glorify and honor God. In this video, we want to continue with this connection between guilt and shame by looking at Adam's shame in the garden. And of course, Adam and Eve do feel shame in the garden when they sin against God. And that's because sin is a disobedient act against God. You're disobeying him, which leaves you guilty before a holy and righteous God. And in your disobedience, it destroys the relationship with God. And you feel a sense of shame because you are guilty before God. In other words, you can't stand in his presence. And so we're just going to look at the theme quickly of shame in the Garden of Eden. So you have this statement when Adam and Eve are created, and then specifically when Eve is created, and we're told that the man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, or cleave to his wife. It says, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So in the Garden of Eden, they're created in this state of innocence. They have fellowship with God, and humanity, of course, is put on probation. They are given a task to obey God, and in this state where they can walk with God, fellowship with God, and they have the task before him to obey God, they are unashamed. Then, of course, the serpent comes, and it's Satan, and he tempts them, and they fall into sin. And then we see in Genesis 3, then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. So they were naked, and they had no shame because they had fellowship with God, and now we're seeing that they're actually disobeying God, and it brings upon them a sense of shame. They recognize nakedness, and it's no longer a state of innocence, and so they feel the shame in being in each other's presence naked, and we'll see in a minute when God shows up. It says they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So they tried to cover their own shame and hide from each other, and of course we're going to see in a second they try, more importantly, to hide from God. Then it says this, and they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees of the garden. So this shame not only leads them to cover themselves, but now to hide from God. They cannot stand in God's presence because they recognize that they have disobeyed God. So the sense of shame comes from their act of disobedience, and as disobedient ones, they are guilty, and so they can't be in God's presence. And so they hear God coming to walk, and you have this phrase, walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Now, scholars debate a little bit what this means, but it literally means, or it can literally be translated, the spirit of the day. And the Hebrew word for spirit can be translated wind or spirit. It's the word ruach. And so there's some debate about what this means. And so some think, well, this is just kind of a cool breeze. I think more likely, if it's to be translated as wind or spirit, I think there's this idea of the judgment of God coming on the clouds here. That's a motif that we see in Scripture. We also see the judgment motif in this phrase that the later prophets dive into, the day of the Lord. I tend to think, though, perhaps it's not the idea of wind, but perhaps the spirit of the day, meaning God is coming down here in judgment. So this isn't some cool breeze blowing through the garden and God shows up and hey guys, where are you? I'm here to hang out. I'm here to fellowship. and then they feel shame. I think this is God coming down ready to judge them in this idea that the later prophets develop as the day of the Lord. Either way, despite the nuances, I think it's pretty clear, however you translate the phrase cool of the day, wind of the day, spirit of the day, it's God appearing in that judgment motif. And so they hide from the presence of God because God shows up to judge them for their sin. And they know they are guilty, and so they feel ashamed because of their guilt. Adam and Eve's sense of shame then is ultimately shame before God because of their acts of rebellion. They can't stand before God because they recognize their guilt. And so what they try to do is they try to cover their sin, and they do this by hiding. It's as if they're trying to escape the judgment of God. And then we go on to verse 9, but the Lord called to the man and said, where are you? And then the man said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid. Why did Adam feel fear? He says, because I was naked and I hid myself. And again, I think we have to read this passage of their understanding their nakedness now in contrast to when they were naked and unashamed. Now they recognize shame because they are no longer innocent before God, but they stand before him guilty. And so they try to hide, they try to escape the presence of God because they know that that presence of God means that God in his holy righteousness will judge them. And so God says, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat? And of course, this is a rhetorical question, but just focus in on that for a second. Why do you know that you're naked? He says. Did you disobey me? In other words, the connection here between shame and guilt is deeply intertwined. God identifies why they feel ashamed and where their fear comes from. They disobeyed God, and they cannot stand before the holy God when they are guilty of sin.